sum up. So I will do the sum up whilst I sum up. It's been fascinating to be here, hear all the perspectives on archiving. I think what I really take with me is that, or my sum up of it is, that there is no question about the importance or necessity of archiving. And then there is, as we've seen, many different ways of going about it. There is, I don't know if, like, there's so many layers to it in relation to both body and mind. Is text the way to archive in relation to, especially if we work with embodied practices? Is the embodied practice itself best communicated in a workshop setting, in a body-to-body communication, rather than translated into text and shared? Is the importance of transcribing knowledge, accumulated knowledge, necessary in order for archiving and artistic processes to be rooted in the systems that already are here in place for artistic research to have its full credibility, if one wants to say like that. Also the perspective of the forgotten or the erased. What do we archive? Who archives? For whom do we archive? And who gets this knowledge? Who gets to be part of exchanging? I think that's about as much as I can conclude of this day. It's been fascinating. I've written down 6,000 questions that, if you want to, I'll read up, but I don't think they'll make much more sense than the ones I've already proposed. But I guess the question I will leave, like the main question is, what structures are needed for archiving to become an integrated, expected and accepted practice? What structures are needed for that to happen? Thank you.
What structures are needed? And then over to Gry Worre Hallberg, Artistic Director of Sisters Hope and member of the Danish Arts Foundation's Committee for Performing Arts Project Funding. I wouldn't say much more than this because my voice is breaking down. But I guess most of you know who you already.
Yeah, okay.
Could you make me go up there so we can see? Yeah. Could you?
Tim was so back.
Sit next to me.
Yeah.
Just so we can see you.
Okay, so yeah, thank you for the invitation to observe, and also since Anna and I founded Sisters Hope, archives have been at the center of our practice. So I also have a personal interest in it, I must say. So I think it's very, very, I'm very grateful that it's being brought forth and being articulated, and I'll do my best on the other side as well, but you know, but yeah. Yeah, and one thing about that also, it's really important to know that, you know, the boards, they are 4 years, and then you have the secretariat. So in terms of this question of where to pass the documentation, it's lots of Kulturstyrelsen. Just because sometimes we have to know where to direct things. And they are also the ones who are like a permanent, more permanent, at least not that permanent, because they are also very precarious and cut 2% each year. There are many things, you know, but more permanent than others. And I think that's important to know when you want to address more permanent issues. Yeah. Okay, but about today, I thought, yeah, I've been writing what is documented, because we've had different layers, I think, of talking about this, because one thing is like phrases from artists, you know, that we document the detritus, I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, but what's left behind, like the kunstnerscape? Or is it participatory experiences? Because, for example, with Sisters Hope, it's a focus on participatory experience, many different participatory layers, to also understand the impact on people being evoked into spaces like this. So that's just an example of two different modes of documentation and archiving, and there are probably more. So what is documented? Also, how is it documented? That has of course been talked about today. Photo film has been mentioned, many has been mentioning, oh, but the camera is so disturbing, but of course there are thousands of ways to document, and that's also something that could be unpacked, and like each of these headlines in a way could have its own day, I suppose. Some mentioned that they use feces papers, others don't have that leg in academia. So how do you then gather or collect your knowledge in a small little box or pile? Kid, I was so amazed, you're like, everything is in here, and I'm thinking about your year-long practice, and then I thought, then you're a good curator of your process, you know, because I'm such a hoarder, you know, so I was like, everything is in that small folder. For me, it would be like 2 houses, you know, so amazing, amazing, very precise in your selection. But there are all these different ways of collecting and archiving. It's not only photo and film, and I think also we can think about how our practice generate archive modes. So it's not something that's just on top of the practice, but integrated and like birthed out of the practice. So there are many, many different ways to do that. And then there is the why. Why is it documented or archived? Also, yeah, we need to maybe distinguish between documentation and archiving. It is 2 different things, but very interconnected. Is it for the future to remember? Like, is it history, writing? Is it to impact the future? Is it to impact people outside the art system? For me, for example, that's an objective. That to translate into other spheres of society that I think should know how important the arts is in terms of overcoming, for example, the polar crisis we're in. So there are different purposes. So what is the purpose of archiving? I think we've been talking a little bit around that as well. Is it to map, to make the invisible visible? Yeah, what's the purpose? And then maybe, yeah, I think I mentioned that up here, but I think, it's linked to this, how is it documented, like this thing of birthing it out of artists' own practice. And I can just say for me, working with an archive is empowering, like artistically empowering. It's linked again to what you said, because it's a little bit, both it's a very emotional and poetic journey into the practice, but also it's a way of building a home, you know, through drawing out your own traces. And sometimes, you know, institutions choose to do that for you, but you cannot depend on that, you know. So it's the self-archiving that we also talked about. And of course, if you're lucky enough to have an institution that do you for you, you can lean into that, you know, that's beautiful. But you can also just take that agency and begin to self-archive in a way that's instinctively and organically true to your own practice. And of course, if you don't want to do that, erase, right? Again, it's linked to your practice. It's not a new responsibility on top of the thousands of other hats, you know, artists are wearing. So, oh, but one little thing, you know, in the things you write application, there's always a documentation post. Who says that cannot be archiving? But,
Speaking of institutions, last to reflect on the day is Anna Lawaetz, a senior researcher and responsible for the theatre collection at the Royal Library in Copenhagen, and thus strongly involved in preserving and making artistic archives accessible for future study.
sharing today, both those who have been speaking and those who have been sitting. It has been very intense. It has been very wonderful to have so many people occupied with archive, and I really feel like there is a need. There's a need in this space for archiving. And when I went to Hong Kong this summer, I also felt this urge, and that was very interesting because that was the institutions who started archiving. Here it's more like it's curational in small institutions or smaller, and it's free artists, right, or artists without a fixed place. It's very interesting. But there they started archiving. I went to a theater and they said, oh, but we are the first theater in Hong Kong who started archiving. And I said, oh, interesting. And when did we start? 2018. Why did you start? Oh, there's this urge right now, you know. And it's about building up a cultural identity, and right now over there, this is what it's about. So when we talk about archiving in this space, for some it's about identity, for some it's about not being forgotten, for some it's about having an idea outside this artistic space to have an impact outside of that. I think it's very wonderful, and there's not one way of doing an archive, right? But if you do not archive, nothing will be left for the National Archive. People are often talking about the institutions as powerful, the archival institutions, but I'm saying, oh, but we are powerless, because if you don't archive, we don't have something to collect. It's true that what we choose to collect, that gives a power. That is kind of a canonizing who is going to have the legacy, it's true. But if you do not save anything, if you, as I was speaking, I was talking with one earlier who said, oh, but I'm too shy to archive art myself today. I was talking, and then I just think, it's important to have the courage to start doing something, and as we said, it has to be true to what you do. And of course there are some good ideas, there are some levels. I work with that you can put checkbox on, there are some things you can do, but just doing it and having the awareness is very important. Then I thought that one other thing that came up today is very important to talk about, and it's digital and the AI, somebody mentioned before, but also just that the archives nowadays are digital. And a French theater researcher, she said, oh, but when it's digital, then maybe the performing arts are not immaterial anymore. We're actually changing format. It's becoming more like visual arts in a UNESCO sense. Or that's a question actually when we become digital. We claim that we are live art, but the digital element changes this radically. It changes the art form, it also changes the documentation. And as an institution, we are discussing right now that we need to go from nachlass, so what Germans call nachlass, what is left when you pass away, to vorlass. So to collect while people are still alive, because the digital is so fragile. You're building online archives, they're very fragile. Don't waste too much time on it. Yeah, then there's this tendency of starting to do education. I think it's wonderful. So we have the Danish Commission who will talk about their program in the spring. And we also had Johanna from Herlev, who are starting educating artists, and I think it's very good. And it's important to be in dialogue with the institution who are going to take care of them in the future, because we also have some expertise, and it would be lovely that we kind of find a good way together. That's a wish. Then Henrik Vestergaard, where are you? Well, 11. Okay, but actually it was wonderful that he challenged Peggy Phelan's view on disappearance and took 360-degree film documentation into this. Yeah, and then of course the burned archive or the lack of archiving was approached by you, and I think it was very interesting because it's like it gives it's something that is missing, but at the same time the imagination kind of grows with what is lacking, and that is actually what archival institutions are dealing a lot with. So if we can't save everything, right? So the art is to do the curation in a good way, and then to leave space for imagination too. And then I think one thing is very important to consider when you work. Now it's a little bit longer, but sorry. But when you work with archiving, you have to think very much about when is the right time for you to give your archive to an institution. Because when it comes into an institution as mine, the status changes. It's kind of freezing. It's not but it will never be accessible in the same dynamic way as when Kip talked about her archive, how she used it and how she changed things in it. When it comes to an archival institution like the Royal Danish Library, then it's going to be safeguarded, and we're using a lot of time on storaging it in that way that you left it, and with all the traces, digital or physical. So it's important to consider when to be ready for giving it, because I think one of the beauty in performing art is actually that there is maybe not from in the personal archive, but we have institutions who have been building up archives, and we have actually a tradition in the field that is very beautiful, that we can lean on, a historical tradition. And as for example, the Royal Theatre Archive was a dynamic archive, and now it's at the National Archive, and the status has changed. It's less accessible for the artists, and you have to consider this thing. It's really important.
Yeah. I could go on, but one last thing I want to say that you touched on a little bit. It was time. It should either be something that you could access very quickly, situated with you, or it should be something where you use time and you situate yourself in the archive with things. And I think time is really important to have in mind also, and to bear with us from this. And then I just want to say that actually, if you can't get enough of this archive fever going on, Nordisk Teaterlaboratorium holds also a workshop session, and the first workshop will be in January, and it's about how to do the archive. So it's with archival institutions and artists, of course, but mainly and also legal advisors and people like that. It's the 17th of January, and I know that you are more than welcome. You just have to go to Nordisk Teaterlaboratorium. So, and yeah, well, I think I was asked I should raise a question, right?
Yes, if you
Yeah.
can.
One thing I was wondering about is that a lot of people here present today are coming from the field of dance, and I'm wondering if there is a special need of documenting. You're saying the process, I'm saying the method. Is there special need for this field and also the performance field that we have to be aware of? Does it differ from more traditional theatre? That would be kind of what I'm going home on, at least. Thank you.
Because you think that the big theatres will document and have a practice, but
it's not only that. Well, they have, and then there's also some about text and how you. There's something about dance, I think, and the performance
that maybe differs and that we have to take into consideration that maybe some of the questions are very important for this special area.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for being so great listeners and help us sum up the day. And you raised some questions, and I think they are you have different approaches, but I think that some of them are focused on the same issue. Namely, is it how do we archive? This is what we have been talking about all day. You said, Tim, do we need what structures are needed? Could you elaborate a bit on this, or?
I can for sure. I'm just thinking in regards to structures. I'm talking about both what is needed for the individual artist to have the time to archive, to have the time to integrate it in the process if it's not already integrated, but also how does one make time and space and financial ability in order to then collect what has been archived in order to be shared and then also share it. So that's one point. And then there's the other point of when it comes to institutions or funding agents and so on, if it can be a two-way thing. Either us artists start asking for money for archiving, or there's an expectation as well from funding bodies and institutions that archiving is part of the process of creating. So that these two things together hopefully creates a more anchored platform where it's accepted, it's expected, it's an integrated part of archiving, so that the knowledge that is accumulated, as many of you also have shared, the knowledge of a product is only a certain percent of the amount of knowledge that is accumulated through the creation process. How is this creation process also archived and shared and exchanged? And then the other part is then, how does then this knowledge that is produced, condensed, shared, where does it also find space to be shared? In what situations, in what structures, in what meetings does that happen?
Yeah. Anyone who wants to comment on this? See, you have some. You collect. Do you have any practice of how to collect? Are people responsible of sending in documentation, archive materials, or is it just the people that, or the dancers, the performers, who wants to be part of, who wants to share their archives with others? How does it work?
They are not obliged to do anything.
No.
They are obliged to send in programs or pliktavlevering, it's the same here. So if you have programs, pamphlets, you have to send them to the National Library. But for our sake, it's totally up to the artists if they want to be a part of this dance archive. At the seminar in November, one attended, is more like in the performance industry, and he was kind of asked, could I be in this dance archive? And of course that is something we showily say, we're happy to host you. And he was really, okay, but then because he feels like he is a part of the dance scene, but is often seen as a performance artist. But of course the performance field in Norway, also some of them are more into the theatre sector and some are more into dance, and it's kind of also an identity question. But of course he was really happy that we said, yeah, sure, we will host your archive as part of the dance archive. And a part of that is also being visible in the later future, because if you can also hand over your private archive to the National Archives, but then you will not be under the umbrella of the dance archive. But all of these archives looks completely different, depending on who's handing in the archive and whether they, how they want the archive to be. Only photos or only videos or material, actually. So it's the artists themselves that kind of provides the archive and also makes the structure of the archive. So we keep the structure that the artists kind of have put into their archive.
I'm sorry. Does anyone want to comment? Do they have any thoughts about that? Yeah, Susanne?
No, I just thought it's not directly adding on to what you're saying, but I just thought about what Tim was saying in terms of working, of anchoring practices of documentation and practices of archiving. And I'm thinking that there's something to be said for, because I think documenting and archiving also has to do with unpacking one's own processes and unpacking one's practices, and being articulating or sharpening one's articulations about it. And there's so many ways, as we've heard today, that in ways in which this can be done. But there's something about the sharing bit. So when is it possible to actually go into a community of shared practices? If you are, I think with Trevor, you were talking about your project with Bettina Lam and the Department of Landscape at Copenhagen University. I mean, that creates quite a frame for this kind of a sharing of artistic practices together with students that have to do with working with landscape, with the interface between landscaping and artistic work. So I think that's a wonderful occasion. That then involves an educational institution, a university, a department, and funding. I hope Bettina, or I don't know if she's funding from elsewhere, but there needs to be funding in that. But I think these are the kinds of fora that we would need, because I think that's also the kind of fora that would create a frame where it's possible to come in, because I think, you know, if we think back 10, 15 years, the idea of sharing your practice, it's like, no, this is mine. You know, I'm not going to share. but on the other hand, as you have shown with Metropolis, and as this forum also shows, the generosity and the exchange that comes out of sharing brings something with it. But I think the more focused it can be, the more conducive to actually bringing new forms, which is what I'm interested in, new forms of knowing, to articulating that. And I think that's the promise for me of working with archiving and documentation and sharing of practices.
Yeah, I think I want to sort of reiterate the importance of the temporality of the process. I think it's, for me, it still sounds quite problematic to think about encouraging artists to think about archiving the process whilst they are in the process. And I think the reference to Kit's example, for example, is it an archive, is it a library, is it a document? Because documentation is very different from archiving, and I think for me it has a little bit of echoes of these voices of, if you cannot sort of leave a product, then it's not been done. And this idea that the traces of what we're doing can only be appreciated if there's something that we can pass on through a commodified kind of medium. And that question of the needs of a live performance, are we actually changing into different forms? I think there is a bit of a danger that if we start expecting artists to think in foresight about documenting or even more so about archiving something that has not yet happened, there's something about archive that happens afterwards. That now when we speak about the temporality of archiving as part of creation process, actually, to me, it sounds a little bit like undermining the creation process. Because there's something about what kind of product do I create before I even know who am I going to be at the end of this creation. So when I have the hindsight, when I have the retrospective, then I can kind of understand what needs to be left from this journey. Because like different people said, we don't want to take everything. We don't want to make everything permanent. And someone already spoke about the loss as part of the human experience. And I would say, what about the bio experience? You know, we are biological organisms. What about the shedding, the dropping, the losing? Yes, creating gaps. So the future generations have a lot of gaps to fulfill, just like we are here sitting, despite the challenges actually try to fill in the gaps. So I don't know, there's something there about the temporality of creation already with living traces that can be archived that is a little bit clunky for me.
So, yeah, I think I would like to say something around this because of course it's us who initiated this way of doing it, because it's very particular, and I was thinking about the way we talk about archiving is, for me, more the traditional archiving, that in the end of a work and something is finished, then you archive it and then you put it into an institution somehow. That's actually not what we were interested with in what we have been doing at Birka. It's very clear that it's artistic processes, it's research and development period. So that's clear, and I also said a little bit in the beginning about the fragility of that, of course, and this is why it's just archiving from the artist. But for me, the objective, which none of you actually had in your objectives, for me the objectives of what we have been initiating is actually to create connectivity. It's to create, to see if there's any way that we can create more connection between artists working in similar fields, having similar ideas, and that we can inspire artists. And we are working, like Metropolis is also on Hout and Earthbound, we are all working in very experimental art forms, which might not even come to a stage at any end. They are very immersive and participatory, a lot of the work. It's very much connected with the landscape and nature and stuff. So we are working in a new artistic field, you could say. And in this field, I just discovered that it was that there was a longing at a lot of the artists to know more about each other's practices and learn more about each other's methods, and this is why actually this is the starting point of what we did at Birka. It's simply to inspire and to connect between artistic ideas, actually to maybe rebel a little bit towards this authorship that an idea belongs to one artist, because it's my experience that it doesn't. That it's always a transference of knowledge, like Naya was also talking about the knowledge sharing, that this is the important part, that we share knowledge, and that we actually, if we can be a community who share knowledge and who stress the fact that we are not solo artists, but that we are actually a community, and that these ideas can be built on each other and can be inspiring each other, then maybe we can actually also, I actually believe we can have more impact in society also by doing this, because what is happening, what I see happening at Birka, for example, is I find this incredibly interesting. Yeah, you can say we don't have a lot of audience maybe coming to Bornholm, but it's interested in kind of research and working into other different areas of research. For example, we have a strong collaboration with marine biologists at the moment, because we've been interested in the water. So if we can somehow find a language in the artistic research and actually make it more respectable that artistic research is a field in itself, that doesn't necessarily lead to a performance in the end, then we can also maybe initiate another kind of dialogue with other fields than our own, if that makes sense. So.
Yeah, I'm just really relieved that that's what you're saying, Susanne, that that's the clarification of the aim, because then I think, why are we not framing these events and encounters as meant to create community by means of archiving? I think there's something of like, where do we put the emphasis? And I say this because I also think knowledge very often is pursued as an aim and a means, like in itself. And maybe it's because I'm coming out of activism. I came to dance from activism, and I think about the framing of knowledge by Paulo Freire, for instance, this thing that knowledge is nothing if it doesn't promote freedom. So there's something about like why, like this question of like who are we archiving for, knowing that it can very well be co-opted by nation-building discourses or by ideas of like solidifying a sector that we can then, I don't know, fundraise more for, we can institutionalize even more, create even more power hierarchies within, which I see the attempt and I really want to applaud that, but I also just want to, look at who are the people that are in this room, the ones that were interested in archiving, and then maybe think about what are all the gaps in the knowledge here, like all the archives that have persisted, that have done a lot of work without being institutionalized. I mentioned in our small group that part of the work that I'm doing is trying to revitalize artists working with existing archives. For instance, the Danish LGBT library, which exists and is there, and you can become a member of it, and there's a lot of knowledge, and maybe we don't need to make a new, let's say, archive community around queer practices, because we already have an archive for queer work. We just need to find a place within it. So there's also this thing of like, instead of artists keeping on being busy with their own artistic research, there's also maybe, where else can we take this work? How can we commune with already existing practices that are not necessarily within the arts? And if the aim is empowerment and liberation, then why don't we frame it as such? And then archiving is just a method to achieve those things.
Yeah, I actually agree that it is that it's a method. It's the method that are interesting, that also a lot of artists are using more and more. This is what I started to train this morning also. And yes, it is the going out of our own community, because of course it's not interesting to enclose ourselves. For example, again, one of the things we're doing next year is going out to the fishermen industry of Bornholm, and that will be a specific archive and documentary questioning how the fishermen's identity is being impacted by the lack of fishing industry and the lack of fish in the Baltic Sea. You know, this kind of like, but it's using the artistic method and tools that we can see is happening to actually initiate new investigations and new areas of interest and new dialogues. And of course it should be out of our own community. Otherwise, we're not there to close in.
More questions? More thoughts? More reflections? Or is this just the end of the day? So, Susanne, would you say anything to conclude? Also, Christina asked me to